series, who I can't think of his name, Bolton,
Yeah.
is shown in several of these. And what he wasn't in the cabinet anymore when it's at the end of Trump's term. So,
Or Steve Bannon.
or Steve Bannon, that's right. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about today, the end of globalization, the end of our series. The title of this is really the end of globalization ? And so, oh boy, I tell you, my techie is really on the ball today. I didn't even have to ask for the key terms to be put up there. Well, the customs union is a block of countries that establish free trade among themselves and agree to a common external tariff. I think probably the best example of that is the European Union. They, those various countries have a free trade agreement among themselves. And then the general agreements on tariffs and trade, often referred to as the GATT, a series of international trade agreements that began after World War II to encourage international trade by reducing trade barriers. And that's the predecessor organization of the World Trade Organization, which is current. And then I guess the big definition for today is globalization, the increasing interdependence and interconnectedness of countries, societies, and economies worldwide, resulting from rapid growth in world trade and advances in communications and transportation technologies. So, and let's go on then to the International Monetary Fund. It's an organization of 190 member countries, part of the United Nations, that seeks to ensure the stability of the international monetary system, facilitate international trade, and reduce poverty. The Marshall Plan, we all remember, I think, a US plan that aided Western Europe in rebuilding efforts after World War II. And then the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association, was a trade agreement enacted in '94. I think that was under Bill Clinton. It was intended to facilitate free trade between the US, Canada, and Mexico by eliminating trade barriers. And of course, that was one of the big effects of that, was a lot of our manufacturing went into Mexico or along the border in Mexico. Adam Smith was a Scottish philosopher considered the founder of modern economics. His 1776 work, The Wealth of Nations, established the foundations of free market economics. And then the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and I don't know whether Josh Hawley is related to this Hawley or not. But anyhow, Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was a 1930 US law that raised tariffs to protect American farms and businesses from international competition. And we do that every once in a while.
Backfired, didn't it?
Yeah, it backfired. A tariff is a tax placed on imports from other countries to make foreign products less competitive against domestic products. And then trade liberalization is almost the opposite, the removal of trade barriers, such as import tariffs, to facilitate free trade. Now, Nelson, can you put the second one up? We got a lot of words today.
Is there a second one?
There's a second key terms.
It's a key term. Maybe this is it.
No, that's the same one.
That's only one.
Well, let me,
Key terms, yeah. Look like second document.
yeah. Well, let me just mention them. If you find it, that's fine.
Yeah, I didn't see it in that email.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure.
Well, anyhow, another term that's just four more, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's fairly recent, was a proposed trade agreement negotiated during the Obama administration between Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam, and the US. And it was replaced by the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2018, after President Trump withdrew the US from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There you go. Value change is a series of activities or processes such as marketing services that increase the value of a product beyond the cost of production, thereby increasing profits. And the World Bank is an international economic organization that seeks to assist developing countries by providing them with loans and technical assistance. And that has been a very important organization in helping very poor countries and also a lot of European countries in the last 10 years. The World Trade Association is an international economic organization dedicated to trade liberalization, in other words, lowering trade barriers. The World Trade Organization seeks to regulate international trade by implementing international trade agreements and resolving trade disputes among nations. So I'm going to go ahead now and talk a little bit about a bigger, longer definition of globalization. As we just saw, globalization is increasing the interconnectedness of nations. Signs of globalization are the interdependence of economics, faster communications, cheaper transportation, and widespread international trade. Globalization occurs when a commodity produced in one place is sold and transported over a wider geographic area, and when events in one location affect those at a distance. For example, the wheat market is global. Anything that affects the world wheat supply has an impact on every other producer. A poor wheat crop in India can affect the price wheat farmers in South Dakota receive. Even closer than that, we saw this happen when that terrific windstorm went through Iowa about a year or two ago and just leveled the corn crop. You know, that had an effect on the corn crop just overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Since the late 20th century, the international trade has increased rapidly. Businesses can now buy all kinds of products from low-cost producers from all over the world. Our purchase of clothing is no longer limited to producers in the USA. And right now, we each may be wearing clothing from several different countries. International trade has raised the world standard of living by increasing the demand for foreign goods and services. The increased demand in turn further raises the world's standard of living. The integration of the world economy has resulted not only from international trade, faster communication, and cheaper transportation, but also because government-imposed barriers have been greatly reduced. Trade barriers include tariffs, holding imports to higher safety standards than domestic goods, and other government-imposed requirements. An example would be a national government that requires a certain percentage of the parts of an automobile to be produced within that country, which I believe is what the United States demands now. In 1900, tariffs averaged about 50% on imports. Now the average tariff on imports is about 15%. So we've gone from 50% to 15%. And in some cases, tariffs are as low as 4 or 5%. Globalization involves the flow of international finance, of lending and borrowing across borders, investment in foreign stock markets, and private foreign direct investment. Smithfield Meats is a Chinese-owned company that has a large meat packing operation in northern Missouri, for example. So more and more, there's foreign countries buying up land investing in buildings and so forth in our country and vice versa. I sent you an article about the Smithfield plant because the current Missouri legislature is, I don't know whether there's a bill. I think there's a bill, or there's at least discussing how much Missouri land should be allowed to be owned by foreign countries. It becomes kind of a defense issue, I think. Okay, globalization didn't just start in the last 15 or 20 years. It has a long history. It began with the migration of people from Asia to North America and from Africa to Europe. The Roman Empire relied on African wheat. Marco Polo traveled to and from India and China trading goods with Europeans. And by the 17th century, the East India Company was sailing to and from South and Southeast Asia. During the Industrial Revolution, 1760 to 1820, international trade intensified, bringing with it a higher standard of living in the Western world. Life expectancy was 38 years old in the late 1700s in the United Kingdom, and in 2010, it was almost 78 years old. So life expectancy almost doubled in the last 150, 200 years in England. That was the closest statistic I could get. Around 1800, there was a turning point in economic history with the beginning of what is called the Great Divergence. This was the movement of goods, people, and services outside each country, a time when it really grew rapidly. Since then, nations that had open trading policies have prospered, while those nations that tried to control trade have shown slower growth. From this series, when you just think about North and South Korea, North Korea has had a closed trading policy. South Korea has an open trading policy, and we know that the standards of living vary widely between those two countries. World War I and the Great Depression resulted in a sharp downturn in globalization. Countries raised trade barriers, hoping this would lead consumers to buy domestically. In 1930, the US instituted the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which raised tariffs to protect American farms and businesses from international competition. But like Jim said, it backfired because other countries retaliated with higher trade barriers. You do it to me, I'll do it to you. At the end of World War II, Europe and Japan had little to export because they were using all their resources to build their nations. During this time, this was after World War II, the US emerged stronger than ever. And the United States instituted the Marshall Plan. And they didn't just to be altruistic. The US instituted the Marshall Plan to help restore the economies of the defeated nations so that we would have trade partners. Some of the international organizations that grew out of that endeavor to restore multinational relations are the United Nations. It was established for political purposes. The International Monetary Fund was created to provide economic stability for world trade. The World Bank was launched to support economic development, especially in poor countries. And the World Trade Organization was initiated shortly after World War II. However, it was not approved by the United States until 1994. And the World Trade Organization provides the legal framework for the international economy by establishing standard practices. There are about 164 members of the World Trade Organization, whereas there's about 190 nations for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. In the 1990s, the economic growth rate accelerated for the entire world. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and Russia joined in 2012. Many of the developing countries have had accelerated growth due to entering the world market. Of course, we know that during the 2007-2008 recession, global trade collapsed. There was a fall in demand, a rise in protectionism, disruption of global supply chains, and a curtailing of access to finance. After the recession, the international economy became more important than ever and delivered a lot. Records indicate that between 2007 and 2015, worldwide poverty was greatly reduced and life expectancy continued to rise. In 2016, the United States pulled back on an open multilateral trading system, the TPP. The US withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and imposed tariffs on Chinese exports to the United States. And like happened 100 years ago, China retaliated with higher tariffs on US products. And the US denounced the World Trade Organization as detrimental to the United States. In 2020, the pandemic had economic consequences as nations protected their supplies of products needed for healthcare. The lockdowns throughout the world hurt the international economy. In the US, the lockdowns basically have led to multiple rescue packages, financial packages. So that kind of brings us up to date. So what about globalization moving forward, particularly this year? The loss of the United States leadership in an open trade system has caused other countries to make protectionist policies. So other countries have moved back following us. There could still be benefits for countries to participate in an open trade system. History indicates that by and large, countries that have open trade will experience better economic performance than those that have trade barriers. Restoring the World Trade Organization would make it easier to address international trade problems, such as Chinese theft of intellectual property. The Chinese are known for stealing DVDs and movies and any kind of intellectual property. Such global issues could be approached much better multilaterally than by any single country. And then, of course, there's the e-commerce and cybersecurity issues, and they could all be better handled by an international response. And of course, environmental concerns call for international cooperation. The environmental issues do not know boundaries. And then finally, economists are watching Brexit, because Brexit is probably the prime example of kind of a protectionist movement. And it's kind of we're watching how Britain disentangles itself from the European Union to see what its effects are and what lessons we can learn from that reversal of cooperative trade. So there's a whole lot going on. We're living, I think, in a real transitional time when countries are assessing which way to go. And that's kind of what the video is about. So let's see how I can do on this 8th try, see if I can get it right the first time. Nope.
The United States stands at this time at the pinnacle of world power. It is a solemn moment for the American democracy. For with primacy in power is also joined an awe-inspiring accountability to the future.
At the heart of U.S. foreign policy is a deep-seated ambivalence. Some American leaders, believing that global problems must have global solutions, have put their faith in institutions with worldwide mandates. Others have derided those same organizations as ineffectual and have asserted that America ought to stand alone. Great Decisions examines the perils and promises of multilateralism and asks whether global cooperation can endure in an era of nationalist retrenchment. The end of the global order? Next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for great decisions is provided by the Hurford Foundation, PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP, and the Nelson B. DELAVAN Foundation.
Every 4 years, American voters head to the polls to elect a president. At issue is not just who will occupy the White House, but how actively the U.S. will engage with the rest of the world.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
America is back, ready to lead the world, not retreat from it.
In his 4 years in office, President Donald Trump pulled the U.S. out of a host of multilateral institutions.
The Trump administration announced today that it will withdraw the U.S. from UNESCO, the United Nations body that protects global cultural heritage, in response to its designation of the old city of Hebron as a Palestinian World Heritage Site.
In a joint statement this afternoon, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley said the U.S. will no longer participate in the UN Human Rights Council.
Today, President Trump formally notified Congress of his intent to withdraw the U.S. from the World Health Organization, the international agency responsible for fighting disease.
One of the things that the United States is we're still the biggest player on the block. Now, we shouldn't yield to the second biggest or the third biggest or worse. We need to pick our alliances carefully, make sure that there are enough shared values that we can feel comfortable with that partnership.
The United States stepping back from that position of international leadership loses U.S. influence. If we leave the table, there are other countries who are quite happy to take our seat.
Three-quarters of a century has passed since the end of World War II ushered in a new system of multilateral commitments. Now, in an era of rising nationalism, the institutions that were built to bring the world together are being tested.
Now, I've been worrying about different aspects of the world for some time and have concluded that we are now on a hinge of history, sort of comparable to what the people at the end of World War II faced.
I think going forward, the real question is, what is the norm? Is the last 75 years the norm and Donald Trump the aberration? Or in some ways, was the last 75 years something of the exception and Donald Trump was a harbinger of a return to America's tradition of holding back from the world? I don't have the answer to that, but a lot of history will depend on that answer.
Today, the General Assembly will take up sub-item A of Agenda Item 105 of the election of 14 members of the Human Rights Council.
In 2006, the UN approved the formation of a body dedicated to the protection of human rights around the world. But George W. Bush kept the US out of this new council.
The idea was that it had become so dominated by anti-human rights members that it was nowhere close to fulfilling its mission. It was clear that it would only be a matter of time before the new Human Rights Council would have the same defects as its predecessor. And that's exactly what happened.
There really isn't a whole lot of evidence in terms of impact of the Human Rights Council in terms of addressing grave human rights situations around the world. The tough cases, those are the ones that the Human Rights Council needs to be focused on, and those countries often ignore the Human Rights Council, even if they're a subject of its resolutions at all.
When President Barack Obama took office in 2009, the US finally joined the UN Human Rights Council.
The logic behind the Obama administration being in the UN Council on Human Rights is to be at the table to try to make it better. It is very fraught, but if we aren't there, then our voice is not there, our values are not there, our purpose is not there.
This was not a naive, idealistic decision. This was based on a very pragmatic assessment of the costs and benefits of engagement versus non-engagement. The idea that the United States would cede leadership on human rights without even taking a shot at this new institution, I think that that was just untenable for the Obama administration.
After 8 contentious years, experts disagreed whether U.S. participation had paid dividends.
I'm proud to say that today, the Obama administration's leadership at the Human Rights Council has delivered real results.
They were successful at the margins. They were able to make some resolutions less troublesome or less onerous or less hypocritical than they otherwise might have been. But again, you still don't see the Human Rights Council under the Obama administration truly focus on those countries that need to be criticized. You didn't see resolutions condemning Cuba. You didn't see resolutions condemning Russia. You didn't see resolutions condemning China.
The results of our engagement at the Human Rights Council far exceeded anyone's wildest dreams. We had 4 special sessions on Syria, and we were very engaged in the creation of a commission of inquiry on North Korea. LGBT rights, we got onto the agenda, and that had been inconceivable just a short time earlier.
I think there's a real question, absent U.S. leadership on the Human Rights Council, whether the Human Rights Council ever would have set up a human rights special rapporteur for Iran to actually investigate and hold accountable the Iranian government for its human rights abuses domestically, at a time when the UN Security Council was blocked by the Russian veto.
In 2018, President Trump reversed course. Once again, the U.S. refused to take part.
When I arrived, and still today, its members included some of the worst human rights violators. The dictatorships of Cuba, China, and Venezuela all have seats on the council.
Another criticism that the Trump administration made of the Human Rights Council is that it is biased against Israel. And that is evidently true. If you take a look at the number of condemnatory resolutions passed by the Human Rights Council, nearly half of them are focused on Israel. To think that Israel is the source of half of the world's human rights problems is simply ridiculous. China has never been criticized or been the subject of a condemnatory resolution by the Human Rights Council.
I think taking human rights seriously is important. You don't have to do that through a council that's 2 principal targets are Israel and the United States. I'm not saying the U.S. has a perfect record on human rights, but we're a democracy. I mean, we're presumably capable of correcting these problems ourselves. We don't need a nanny in Geneva lecturing us.
The way the UN Human Rights Council is evolved is a travesty. And I can see why the Trump administration would say, we're not going to have anything more to do with this. The question is, does it help? Do you want to throw your toys out the pram and just not be there at all? I think the view of the British government is it's better to be inside fighting that case than to say we leave.
With the U.S. on the sidelines, China worked tirelessly to expand its influence within the UN Human Rights Council. Those efforts secured international support for controversial policies in Xinjiang and Hong Kong.
There was a recent episode where China was successful in building a coalition to support its narrative about its role in Hong Kong. And this is a perfect example of where if the United States had been present, we would have been able to work the halls and find more country support and really change the narrative about whether China actually does have the support of the majority of countries.
What we've seen in recent years is China increasingly using its vast economic leverage to try to bring countries to its side within the UN. It's not facing much competition. It's incumbent on liberal democratic nations that believe in human rights to mobilize coalitions of countries so that China can't just waltz into the United Nations mobilize its coalition and then go uncontested.
American policymakers who hope to challenge China's global ambitions must determine whether to work inside or outside of existing institutions.
The universal principle, I believe, is this. If America unilaterally withdraws from the UN and multilateral institutions, it simply creates a bigger slice for major non-democracies like China to exercise even greater influence in the future. Far better, the United States remains in and prosecutes in each of these agencies a general reform program to make them as effective and as efficient as possible.
Multilateral organizations, they're always going to have a hard time agreeing on certain principles because you have this diversity of cultures and values and forms of government. I mean, on the one hand, you have China, which has an emperor for life, and then you have the United States, which is laissez-faire. And when you have those extremes and then all the diversity in between, it's always going to be difficult, which is why multinationals are always frustrating to Americans.
We have dozens of countries around the world who are at least open to and prepared to work with us. China does not have that for the most part. So I don't look at these institutions as somehow biased against the United States. And even in those occasions where they might be, that to me is a challenge for foreign policy. How within them do we build coalitions? That's why God invented diplomats.
Let us not fail to grasp this supreme chance to establish a worldwide rule of reason, to create an enduring peace under the guidance of God.
Today, the allied world salutes these representatives of 50 nations. They have made a beginning, a brave beginning that can build a mighty structure for peace.
When World War II ended, the U.S. championed the formation of the global order we know today.
The United States was the architect of so many of these multinational organizations. You know, they came out of, in so many ways, a devastated world in 1945 and a belief by Americans that the way to avoid catastrophic wars in the future was to create international institutions that were basically channels for dialogue and problem solving.
That was a very different world, a very different United States. Balance of power, distribution of power was far different. These institutions now have 75 years of a track record, not always, shall we say, glorious.
Even as the U.S. government embraced multilateralism, a strong undercurrent of skepticism ran through American politics.
I just say the hell with the UN. What is it anyway? An activating society. What could this do? Very little.
The US can afford to be much more self-sufficient and independent than just about any other nation in the world. America always kind of stood a little bit to a side on these things, and it was given the permission to do that because most Western nations thought, look, we don't mind if America does its own stuff now and again, as long as it's inside the multilateral institutions when we need it to be.
Well, I suggested on the floor of the Senate today that we stop all funds for the United Nations. Now, what that'll do to the United Nations, I don't know. I have a hunch it would cause them to fold up, which would make me very happy at this particular point.
Well, in the United States, like in Australia and other Western democracies, it becomes an item of political sport, particularly within the political right and the far right, to just go on a general campaign of UN bashing. Why do politicians do that? It's because this attack on globalism, this straw man argument, has become a part of the identity politics of the right and the far right.
Globalism exerted a religious pull over past leaders, causing them to ignore their own national interests.
Today, the world looks very different from the circumstances of 1945. It is not so easy for bureaucratic institutions to evolve rapidly to face new challenges.
It's going to be very hard to see those organizations change. It's not that people don't know how they should change. It's that the major powers that comprise these institutions have to be prepared
to bring their publics along. There's no magic wand that can be waved by the citizenry on their own, or by the Secretary General, or by any particular country.
What is the point of pretending that the organization is still committed to its original principles? And if that tension means that the organizations don't work, as many parts of the UN system didn't work during the Cold War, that's unfortunate, but then that ought to lead people to say, what are the alternatives? Not just keep plowing along as if the problem didn't exist.
You have seen over the history of the UN a surprising degree of innovation in looking at new ways to solve problems as they confront them. Something like peacekeeping was not in the UN Charter. The UN invented it when they had to in the middle of the Suez Crisis in 1956. So there are all kinds of ways that the UN, working with partners, needs to look at solutions in innovative ways. When organizations depend on consensus, a member state that refuses to live up to its commitments can spark frustration and recrimination.
In the early days of the WTO, we tried to operate fully by consensus. We're now at 164 members, and deciding every single thing by consensus has become unmanageable. So what members are doing, they are figuring out how to advance the most sensitive issues. Flexibility is the only way, I think, the WTO can continue to operate itself in a progressive and quick enough manner.
To the extent that international organizations deal with political issues, you're going to see further gridlock as the member states disagree. And you saw this during the Cold War when the United States and the Soviet Union were often at odds.
The staunchest defenders of the multilateral order insist that institutions are merely forums where member states can interact. It is up to those individual countries to learn to cooperate.
There is no other forum where this is going to disappear. Whatever forum, whatever setup you design, you're still going to have different opinions. It's not changing the name of the forum or the place of the forum or the countries that are inside the forum that it's going to change the outcome.
Richard Holbrooke used to say about the UN that blaming the UN for a crisis is like blaming Madison Square Garden when the New York Knicks play badly. When are we going to get the kinds of reforms of these organizations that we need to make them fit for purpose in the 21st century? When the governments that comprise UN bodies are willing to back those reforms.
Throughout American history, policymakers have feared that the empowering of international institutions might impinge on national sovereignty.
I do not recognize higher law than the Constitution in temporal terms. I'm leaving religion out of this. We are sovereign, and the Constitution provides no opportunity to delegate that sovereignty to some international body.
My own view is that there's a false dichotomy that's often created between sovereignty and cooperation. One of the best ways to advance the sovereign interests of any country, including the United States, is by working with allies, working with other partners where you share common interests. And that's really how these institutions were created and what they're for. Today, politicians who worry about the loss of sovereignty have mounted fierce opposition to American participation in the International Criminal Court, a tribunal founded in 2002 to prosecute individuals for crimes against humanity.
I've said before, the happiest day of my entire government career was the day that I unsigned the Clinton administration's signature on the Rome Statute creating the ICC. I think it's a thoroughly illegitimate institution. We don't recognize any international authority to judge American citizens. We judge American citizens.
I received word this morning that the ICC appeals chamber authorized an investigation into the activities of the Taliban and U.S. and Afghan personnel there. This is a truly breathtaking action by an unaccountable political institution masquerading as a legal body.
Our nation and this administration will not allow American citizens who have served our country to be subjected to illegitimate investigations.
There are, I think, real and legitimate concerns about the International Criminal Court and about its jurisdiction and how it could be used to affect American diplomats, American servicemen. And the ICC was not designed for situations where a country had a robust legal system.
Those who champion global institutions face an urgent question: how to present an effective case for multilateralism to skeptical voters.
The key challenge for any national political leadership is on matters of global governance to explain to their domestic political constituencies our membership of these international institutions, primarily in terms of their ability to advance our domestic national interests. And then you argue, and by the way, it helps the world as well.
The challenge with a narrow form of nationalism, a kind of insularity of worldview that leads you to believe that you can close your borders and solve your problems, is that the facts are not going to respect that ideology or that way of governing. We're not going to set back the clock, right? You're not going to see the end of global air travel or the end of global commerce.
The good news is, compared to 1945, we've got democracies on every continent. We have nations that are moving more and more toward respect of democratic values, but we also have democracies that are stressed. The authoritarian nations of the world moved into a new chapter of trying to promote the idea that authoritarian governance models are the right ones for the 21st century. I think we have to rebut that critique, not just by trying to be a strong democracy in the United States, but by pulling democracies of the world together.
Those non-Americans who have observed the shifting attitudes of the US government most closely are optimistic that multilateral organizations can function effectively even without US participation.
I watched very carefully the World Health Assembly, which is the highest decision-making body of the WHO. The European Union was the one that was stepping forward and proposing, really sort of drafting all of the key decisions. That's a role that historically I think the United States often had, but with the US absent, it was Europe that was able to bridge the different gaps.
A call for like-minded countries in Europe, in Asia, and in the Americas to triage the institutions of multilateral governance until we re-establish a level of geopolitical equilibrium between China and the United States. The ball, I think, well and truly lies in the court of an incoming Biden administration. But I do think this is the last chance saloon for American global leadership.
It may be that we'll look back again at this and say the idea that you need a country to lead us out of a crisis is a very 20th century notion, and that leadership has become much more fragmented, diverse, as has power, and therefore we shouldn't be expecting America or any country to come up and lead.
Since 1945, the world has learned that multilateralism is messy, tedious, frustrating, and imperfect. Partnerships form and dissolve, and institutions come and go. But at a time when emerging threats can so easily cross borders, the nations of the world have little choice but to find some way to work together.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom. And
there was your kite, Bill.
Yeah, sure enough, there was my kite. Well, nothing is easy, is it?
I'm not sure that the name of this particular thing followed with the presentation they made.
Say a little bit more about that.
I'm not sure that, you know, the globalization, the end of globalization, I was looking at it more in terms of trade and all those things, and that part never got in there. It was all more about the institutions that we have that are international, that people argue about all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, they were all global institutions. I guess that was the thread that held the two things together.
She's right.
I didn't hear that. What? I didn't. Well, somebody said something and I didn't catch it.
Oh, Lee said she's right, meaning Margaret Hurd is right.
Yeah. Well, do you think any country can ignore the growing trends of globalization in favor of isolationist policies?
I don't think that's possible.
We have to be, you have to have a seat at the table. If you're not there, then they forget about you or your issues aren't raised. And as much as we dislike it, or a particular group, I think we still have to be there. Some of the things we may decide as a country we don't want to support as much. But otherwise, I think we still have to be in those meetings.
Yeah, and all of these global organizations are no more than forums.
Yeah.
And, it's like Samantha Power said, I thought that was wonderful. Blaming the United Nations for when things go wrong, makes as much sense as blaming Madison Square Garden when the Knicks are playing lousy basketball.
Yeah.
I mean, it's apples and oranges.
Right.
Well, I can see why my son decided to leave the diplomacy school when he was in college. He's like, you can present people with facts and you can present people with all the data that they need to make good decisions, and they're still going to do what they want. And we see a lot of countries doing that, despite these diplomatic institutions that are trying to promote cooperation.
But that's most of these institutions that are promoting cooperation. The cooperation may be for that institution's benefit and not necessarily, as I think they view it as not necessarily their way of doing things.
Yeah, and
I think go ahead, Ave.
I think it is important that any member of any of those organizations has to be prepared for a give and take. One country cannot expect to push through all of their wish list without leaving room or some room for other countries, that have some needs that are equally as important. And but I think it still benefits us, because just especially in trade, America couldn't even exist anymore. We would be starving if we wouldn't have international trade, and we wouldn't have any money anymore if China would pull out all of the money or would freeze all of the money that we owe China.
Yeah. Remember, I recall back the Ugly American. When we used to be, that was our title across the world. We kind of got over that a little bit, but then I think over the last 4 years or so, maybe that title has come back to haunt us again. But yeah, as you say, these are forums. That's where you discuss things, you have opinions, and then after that is when you go back to your country and say, okay, this is what the world is saying, and where do we fit in, and what's to our advantage, what isn't, and then you can negotiate. But there's nothing wrong, I don't think, with a country, with an agency that shows facts. I mean, I don't believe that these should be used for ranting and raving about a particular issue that isn't based on facts, but certainly spreading true information is always good.
And I think that if history teaches anything, it's that when communication breaks down, wars break out. I mean, as long as there's a forum, you know, there's hope.
Right.
And the other thing Margaret said, I got tickled about the ugly American image kind of returning. You know, I think it's not so much what Trump did as the way Trump personified it. I mean, he's just visually, and his voice and everything else it's just, you know, everybody's image of the ugly American.
A bully all across.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Why do you think so many people, I guess they don't understand it, but you know, you always hear this concern that we're a sovereign nation and we will never have any organization rule over us. And I don't think the United Nations or any of those groups have ever threatened that or claimed that. That's not in their constitutions. But that sure is a strong argument, I think, in this country is.
But I think Americans have been taught and have been told so many times, our country is the greatest country on earth. And these people who have never been outside of the United States haven't even seen that there are other countries that have something from which we can learn. And if you have a public that is so uninformed, and then the social media help, from what I read, is any correction of falsehoods reach very few people compared to the falsehoods that are being spread. I think social media, that's going to be a major problem.
Go ahead, Wade.
Do you all have any concerns about the International Criminal Court? Because I think maybe if there's one area of multilateralism and internationalism to maybe be a bit suspicious of, it's that. And, you know, I don't think there's anything about participation in that requires us to cede our national sovereignty. But, you know, it just seems to me that if there's one area where we do need to be conscious of protecting our sovereignty, maybe it's that. Maybe it's that one organization.
But it isn't always quite fair. I think what America is trying to do to just protect those decisions by the military that really were very questionable. And so America wants to protect those people instead of exposing them at the International Criminal Court. They are worried that some crimes are being found out that really do need to be, that do have some repercussions.
It's a fair point.
Yeah, we do have a major, we do have a strong judicial system, but if we don't enforce it with every citizen, then, you know, I think that's part of the problem. If we stood up and began those investigations, then that would probably keep this ICC group from interfering. They would stand back and watch.
Yeah.
But we've not done that in certain cases, and then we've overturned other cases that were tried and people convicted, and then we let them go. That doesn't do wonders for our ability to say we're strong law enforcement and law-abiding people.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Pam.
I need you history buffs, Wade, in particular. So how did the Nuremberg trials come about? Who was the authority? Because, you know, that was important that
I think.
But I think the Germans realized that these people who perpetrated and cooperated in this terrible evil with all the concentration camps, that needed to be dealt with. I think the Americans played a major role in that. Is that true?
They did. The Nuremberg trials, that was, you know, my understanding is that was not, that had nothing to do with the newly formed United Nations. Those were the allies, you know, that won the war.
That's what I thought. The allies, yeah.
Acting together, you know, that put on that little tea party.
Well, it just seemed when they were talking about that international court, that I just immediately thought about that and how the world came together to call out the wrongs. So
I'm not sure we could say the world came together other than the allies. A number of those Nazi sympathizers and what wound up in South America.
Oh gosh, yes.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So it was more. I think the allies took one look at all of the things that had happened in the concentration camps and the horror that they found, that they knew they had to do something more than just win the war, and that those people maybe, and I think that the German people helped too, to say, well, there was this difference in there were soldiers, and then there were people who were just mean, nasty, awful people that were perpetrating some of these other things, and that's how it.
So is the Human Rights Council made up of a lot of countries that we would consider allies then? And then how do you enforce? Because the Nuremberg trials were basically about human rights that were.
They were thrown into prison, and I think several of them sat for years in the major prison in Berlin. Albert Speer, I just can think of his name off the cuff. He was
Eichelman. No, there was. I don't remember.
Well, let me just raise one more question before we're almost at 2 o'clock. But which nation, in your opinion, is the leader of the globalization movement today?
Well, I think it's probably Angela Merkel, I would say. I don't know if I'm right, but I think she has contributed a lot.
Well, she may have contributed a lot to the good side, but I would say China.
Well,
the concept of global, you know, there's China's idea of globalization, and then there's the EU concept of globalization. I mean, they're two completely different things, looks like to me.
China certainly has their hands on every continent and investments in every continent. And in some respects, they justify it by saying they have such a huge population to feed and to house that they need resources from all over the place. But
and they seem to do it very cleverly. They don't tie any human rights, you know, with it. They just go in and help with money. And which country, you know, is willing to turn down a bunch of money and a bunch of help in terms of constructing various projects?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. When you're poor.
Well, it seems like they've taken the place of the World Bank.
Yeah, that's right.
Jim, what do you want to say? Jim,
I was just enjoying the discussion.
Okay, I thought I heard your voice. Okay. Well, this has been another one we haven't solved. We're batting 100%.
Still very enlightening and informing.
Yeah, it is informing. I just find it very interesting, and things that you just don't think about every day.
And you really contributed to that, Bill. Wow, the work that you have put in to the information that we were able to gather through you is really fantastic.
Well,
here.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Well done, Bill. Well done.
I appreciate all of your participation and your insights. And one of the things I appreciate more than anything is the civil discourse. You know, we are not all in agreement by a long shot, and yet we're able to talk to one another And I just think, to me, that's what democracy is all about and what this country is all about. And there aren't too many places where I can find that. So I'm really thankful that I have found all of you for this civil discourse.
I'll second that, Bill. And I was interviewed this morning. Every fourth Wednesday morning, I get interviewed by the radio show Diane Jones, and I was touting this program, and she did ask after I touted it a little bit, you know, and I listed some of the topics, you know, China and Suez Canal and all the things going on, and she was like, well, "How do you keep it civil? How do you keep it from being a big argument?" You know, discussing these big explosive topics. Now she's a radio show host, and so they tend to. You know, they tend to be a little more aggressive in their conversations, and they're looking for the disagreement and really good at that.
Nelson, what you do is you sign up a bunch of really elderly people that came up in a different era that were raised right, so to speak.
But you also accumulated a lot of knowledge yourself. And what we see with the ideological opinion, they just kind of observed in their little corner, you know, that they don't like blacks or that they don't like Asians or whatever. And then that's what they go for, you know, without much background information.
Yeah.
Well, we also have we have a very, very good moderator too, that always exhibits calmness and serenity. And I think that definitely holds some of us back as well. So,
yeah.
Well,
thanks, Bill.
You're welcome. And I guess we'll do this again next year if hopefully in person.
You're elected.
Everybody stay safe.
Okay. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.